Welcome to Table Stakes, the podcast for responsible, sustainable leaders and companies, brought to you by Veerless. Table Stakes discusses the issues of sustainability with forward-thinking leaders to forecast the future of responsible business. Being ethical, human, and sustainable is no longer optional. It's table stakes. I am so excited today to be joined by two of my favorite people in the world of corporate responsibility, sustainability, ESG, all the things, Katherine Smith and Dave Stangis. Dave, Katherine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to catch up again.
And I was just telling Dave and Katherine, they're my first book podcast of this series, but there are lots more to come. So really cool things to talk about. And I'm starting this series because I'm about to get to my 10th annual book list that I do every year. And you guys are about to celebrate 10 years since your book came out, right? It was 2017. I looked back. And it's funny, I went upstairs to my book closet and I think I gave someone your book because I couldn't find it. So
we'll send you another one.
Gift, Marcy.
It does make a good gift. You guys wrote two versions of your book, but let's just kind of start at the beginning. You know, Katherine with Boston College and Dave, I know at the time you were at Campbell's and, on the board and executive leadership at Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship. Kind of talk about your book, 21st Century Corporate Citizenship. How did that come to be? Where did the idea come from? And how did you decide to put this thing together?
Yeah, the genesis is that we had the center, Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship, was approached by Emerald Publishing with an inquiry about whether we would consider selling our magazine, The Corporate Citizen. And
interesting.
We would not consider selling our magazine. But that led to conversations about what we might do with Emerald Publishing. And Dave and I had been talking anyway about the fact that there were so many books in the market that tell stories of success, but not any books that we could point to that gave the recipe for success. And then I'll turn it over to Dave to pick it up.
Yeah, I still remember the executive forum. I'm not sure if we're still calling it that, Katherine, but there was this kind of leadership body, and Katherine asked me, kind of just in passing. It was like in a break. Hey, I'm thinking about this. You want to write this book? And I'm like, no. And I think I said no a few times. And I remembered the story was I actually drafted an outline because everybody's brain works differently. My book would be like 10 pages long, and it would be those question sets at the end of each chapter. Like that was it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote the outline back in Intel days because I thought during then I might have a book in me. And the more I thought about it, and you talked a little bit about it before we actually got on the air, Marcy's attention spans and the way people absorb information.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, nobody reads books anymore. Everybody's doing podcasts. But anyway, we talked a lot about it. And we talked about the division of duties and swapping out chapters and how this might come together. And we both had, basically a book in our brains that we merged together. And it took a long time. It was definitely a labor of love. We might have gone into it thinking we had, two.
That was actually your brilliant idea.
21st Century Corporate Citizenship. And then was it at the same time or was it a few months later? I'm doing part of this podcast series because I want to learn from people who've been in the space. I'm in the middle of book writing process. And it's interesting. There is a lot in the space for practitioners. And if you want to learn about corporate responsibility or sustainability, if you work in the space, but there is a void in that sort of executive's guide. And if you are not a sustainability person, but you want to do it right inside your company. So you guys wrote at the same time, but released a little separate.
Yeah, one of the chapters in the book really focuses a lot on audience-based communication. It's a kind of a soapbox issue for some of us. And the one book is really intended for the practitioner. It is a practitioner's guide. And we knew that, going in. If you picture yourself as a CEO or a board member, you wouldn't really enjoy reading that book. It's talking to a different part of the company. But it's the same message. Literally, you need the same things to succeed to make your company better. So it wasn't a big leap of intellectual faith to get to the other book. It was we need to change the audience and write the content, ask the questions for this other audience.
So the executive's guide is, and this was Dave's brilliant idea because Dave, as an executive in sustainability and corporate responsibility, always was having to sell ideas up to his colleagues in the C-suite and across. And so he had deep experience in knowing, the brevity was very important. And in that audience, probably testimonials from others like them were going to be very important. And so the books were actually designed to work together. So the executive guide is actually the thing you would hand to your boss if they asked you a question. And the practitioner's guide was how you're going to answer the question, because each book is 10 chapters and each book has 10 questions at the end of each chapter. So if you can answer the 100 questions in the book, then you actually have a defensible plan.
Yeah.
You're
That's
done.
great.
Like literally,
You're-
that's the
You've
challenge.
done
Answer
it.
the questions and then like go to work.
You've done it. That's amazing. And you said this before we got on the air, Dave, but you had this baked in audience in Boston College, right? And I remember you guys launching the book at the big Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship conference. Did people invite you guys to come teach their executives? What did you hope the book would do? How did you kind of bring it out there as you launched?
As I look back on it, it's a little frustrating because we did a podcast, Katherine and I, we individually spoke a couple times at different places. I think we did at least one course on it where people could sign up and kind of go a little bit deeper, and we would guide them through the course. And that was probably standalone, either with a Center for Corporate Citizenship conference or maybe another conference. I was able to, kind of talk a little bit about it at a Green Biz conference in the past. And I know some colleagues of mine that used it in teaching, and I still know some colleagues that recommend it, to people that they engage with. And it definitely had some pickup early on. And the reason I kind of get frustrated now is because of the churn in the marketplace and the concern that a lot of senior leaders have. And I just want to like hit them over the head with a book. And like, if you would have read this book, like you wouldn't be dealing with this stuff, because it's the stuff, but that I shouldn't be saying that on podcast, but it's just a basic business book. But we didn't go out and market it. I actually personally don't know like how many we sold. We both contributed every penny that ever came from the book back to the Center for Corporate Citizenship. So it was really a labor of love, a nonprofit piece of work. As much attention as it could.
Yeah. Katherine, does the center still use it? You guys have lots
We
of
do.
courses and classes and things like
Yeah.
that.
So we've distributed, I think at this point, and this again agree with Dave, it's very hard to get good reports from anyone in the publishing industry. So if you're like thinking about writing a book for money, don't do it.
No.
Because the money is not in the book. The money is in the speaking engagements. And that's the model for the business. The book is a loss leader to get you into the speaking engagements. With that being said, we did land on the Amazon bestsellers list in our category several times near the first launches of each of the books. And at the center, we did do a bulk buy as well. So we have distributed probably close to 5,000 of these books through our courses. And we point to them as the how-to reference. Like they definitely walk away with instructional materials when people come to our classes, but also they walk away with this book, which is if you lose that big binder, you can't stand to walk around, carry the big binder around. You always have the like slim book, right? That will give you the basics and the nuts and bolts of what you should be thinking about. So we do still use it in our courses.
So what would you do? I'm curious now, 10 years later, in a very different moment today than 10 years ago. Although we were, 2017, we were in the beginning of a first Trump administration, and that was decidedly anti-ESG, but very different today. Would you put different things in the book? Do you think the structure still stands? If you do these 100 questions, you're solid. Does that still stand?
First thing I'd probably do is adjust the title for the current environment. Something about navigating, whatever. I haven't given it much thought, but I could come up with a better, a more timely title for people in our sector. The one thing I would clearly add is, and it would fit in one of the chapters, or we would add a chapter, although I like the kind of 10 and 10 thing, so I might stick to that. But, a lot of the teams, even the team that, worked for me at Apollo and I'm still engaged with every day, is spending a lot of their time figuring out how to leverage AI. There's no doubt about it, right? So how to turn all the tools the enterprise AI tools they have at their disposal, everything that, we can do in terms of whether it's prompt engineering or LLM management to generate content, make better investments, predict risk in the supply chain. There would definitely be a section on that, because I think that is a lot of what sustainability corporate citizenship people are doing, are looking at levers to make their companies better. And this is one of them. But that's really it. It would just be an updated adaptation of the content. Would be, you still need strategy and metrics and, a line definition of success and storytelling. And, you still need everything else that's in there. Mapping out your business model. The one thing we continue to talk about is helping people in our profession get the business acumen to really dissect their companies. And that's all in there as well.
Yeah. I agree with that. And that was actually one of my things, technology and digital. I think I would also go harder on inclusion. Because it is such an important issue societally, and there's such a tremendous misunderstanding about it as a strategic business issue. Everybody who's going to be in the workforce in 2045 is born already, right? There is no changing the demographics of this country, and we all just have to get comfortable with the fact that they are changing. And helping business leaders understand how to talk about that, I think, would be an opportunity for today.
It's a great point. Because it's also a treacherous space if you do it wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. And it's been under attack more. I mean, I certainly have felt the attacks on sustainability and ESG, but it's been nothing like the folks in diversity and inclusion have felt. And it's the first day of Pride Month.
Right.
Our branding for Pride Month at Veerless is inclusion is sustainable. What do we want to do, and how do we want to think about that? Like you said, demographic shift and everything that's changing. And it's really important to think through. Let's talk about language, because I think there's so much confusion in the world about corporate citizenship, ESG, sustainability, corporate responsibility, impact, all the things that we say. And you said you might have changed the language, but Boston College is stuck with corporate citizenship. I think for me, that tends to be the most broad view, maybe, versus ESG or sustainability or CR. Where do you guys sit today in terms of that term, corporate citizenship, how it applies? Was this pre or post Citizens United? Post, right?
Post.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that, I know citizenship got a little hit during. Yeah.
Just because it is core to our brand and we think about it a lot, but the citizenship word for the center is about how the company exercises per Citizens United rights, responsibilities, obligations, and privileges. And that happens in the responsibility departments and sustainability departments, but also across the operations. That's why we take the broad view at the Center for Corporate Citizenship. And that's why we hang on to that language.
I think in hindsight, you can see the wisdom in sticking with something, right? Citizenship, corporate responsibility, these are now safer terms than they were for a while. I was not opposed to sustainability, that term. I was not opposed to actually ESG, because I was in a company and a sector where the world doesn't realize this, the kind of common normal press, kind of noise around it. But it was an adaptation on all these other terms to try to demonstrate, if you were a company, that you were actually trying to be more strategic. You were trying to be more focused on investor concerns. And once the finance sector started to take it and name things, then, it went off the rails. I've talked to a lot of senior executives that have been around the block for a long time, and they too, if you ask them now, and even in the midst of all of this kind of naming, soup, they still liked corporate responsibility and corporate citizenship. Every once in a while, they thought, well, maybe it sounds a little too nice, or it sounds like an obligation versus something we want to do. But in hindsight, they always kind of understood it, And you can't always say that about sustainability or ESG especially. So I think there's some wisdom in it. I still, terminology still frustrates me as a person, because I think it's a crutch when we don't know how to describe what we're doing in business terms, right? Not in all cases, right? A company needs to be a good corporate citizen, right? It needs to be respected. But, when we kind of then talk about license to operate, we lose half the room, right? We know what it means, but, so I think like that's the only frustration I have. When I see, a trend out in LinkedIn or some other social where we're going to try come up with a new name. I don't weigh in, but I sure feel like I want to weigh in. And, again,
I do weigh in. It's there. Nothing, my team knows, nothing annoys me more than there's one every day posts about the differences between ESG, sustainability, CSR. It's like the minute we sit in a room and try to put up a slide about the subtle nuances between this word and that word, we've lost it. It's gone, and let it go.
And
I'm
it's usually from somebody that's never worked in a large
Yes.
publicly traded company. It's usually somebody that hasn't had that, chance or that
Yeah.
opportunity to work
Yeah.
in a large publicly traded company.
It's one of the first pieces of advice Dave gave me when I came to this job now. Like, I'm going into my 17th year here in the center. And I sat down with every member of the executive forum at that time. And now the executive advisory board. And I said, what do you think I need to know about this job, about this field? What's the most important thing? And Dave said, do not get drawn into the rabbit hole of what you should be named or called. Everybody knows what we're talking about. Like, the terminology has to fit the culture of the company and the expectations of the leader, and just,
And the center has had its name forever, right? I mean, it's always been the Center for Corporate Citizenship.
in my tenure, it did. It changed maybe 10 years before I came. So it had initially been the Center for Corporate Responsibility.
Interesting.
Wow, I
Okay.
didn't know that. Huh.
At the very beginning.
That's
I
what we
think
called it. I mean, when we created this job for the first time ever at Intel, that's what we called it.
for the
Corporate
first 10 years. So the
Yeah.
center is almost 45 years old now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. For the first 10
That's
years,
incredible.
it was
I'm curious, just to keep on the language piece. One of the things that I don't see as much, and maybe it's because it's gotten so roped into compliance, is I just don't hear the word ethics out there. And I'm curious, Katherine, from inside a university system, ethics can live in the philosophy department, right? It can also live in that sort of like compliance and legal space. Have you heard more people using, kind of single terms like ethics, morals, purpose more recently? Or do you feel like people are sticking with this, responsibility or sustainability language?
I think what I'm hearing more is responsibility and sustainability language. I will say I teach in the MBA program, and there is here at Boston College at the Carroll School, and there is an expectation that every course in the curriculum has an ethics component integrated into it. And when you're talking about stakeholders, as we do in this space, when we're talking about governance, we're really often talking about multi-stakeholder consultative processes, which Dave is also like a tremendous resource and expert on. Thinking about the impacts and the outcomes of the company on the communities, whether you're anywhere in your value chain, has to be part of the ethical considerations of the company.
I'm a big fan of the ethic kind of space. As Katherine knows, and you may know, Marcy, but Boston College is a Jesuit university. My undergrad is a Jesuit university.
My undergrad is Benedictine, so very similar.
I
Yeah.
took more ethics courses than I know what to
Mhm.
count in my undergrad, including business ethics. And a guy named Jerry Kavanaugh was my professor, Jesuit priest, recently passed. And but I mean, a lot of my interest in this whole space goes back to those days when I never thought I would do this work. But I remember at Intel, we had an ethics and compliance oversight committee. I sat on this thing. We met every month. We dealt with really thorny issues. I'm sure there are groups like this in companies. Maybe they're the audit committee, or maybe they're the subset of the thing. But I think it's probably a little scary for large, big, publicly, visible companies to throw around the word ethics. But I don't think it should be. I think there's some wisdom that actually can be applied when you bring ethics principles to a tough decision and actually talk about them instead of here's our code of compliance. Does it comply or not? Right. But I agree with Katherine. You used to find code of ethics in company policies, and most of those are now code of compliance.
Code of conduct. It's interesting. I've been writing this book, I've been jokingly calling it Ethics for Capitalist Assholes. And I don't know if that's
a selling title.
But that's what I keep jokingly calling it. And I've gone through periods of I read all of Simone de Beauvoir last year, thinking about real hard ethics. Where are we? But it's interesting, having gone through the MBA program at Northwestern at Kellogg too. It feels like, sitting next to a lot of who are now CEOs. At the time were kind of budding CEOs, but a lot of my classmates have now stepped into those roles. Sustainability sometimes goes straight over their heads, right? Goes, whew, ESG, yeah, that's a thing. We have a department for that, or maybe we don't. But when you talk about purpose, ethics, morals, they get it, and they're closer to it than I think some other things. I will hand your book to anybody who wants to be a practitioner, but there isn't a lot out there for people who work outside of this space in business to understand how to build responsible companies from the position of, manager who works in manufacturing, or a director in supply chain, right? Like, how do those guys come at these issues?
I agree. Jeffrey Hollander just came out with a book that I've seen bits and pieces of. We did a little podcast where he talked a little bit about it. I have to admit, I haven't read the whole thing cover to cover, but I know he's dealt with some of this stuff of literally trying to do the right thing and kind of running into brick walls. And we use that language, I know it, at Intel all the time. And Craig Barrett and Andy Grove were, we could have this conversation like, is it the right thing? We would use the language like, what is the right thing to do here? And I'm sure that happens, but I know I haven't heard that language. It's clearly a cultural thing within a company's leadership to talk about that. And I think a lot of our challenges is dealing with that ambiguity and helping the company that wants to drive its bottom line to where we and others want to do the right thing.
But it's also a sustainability leaders purview. And one of the things that impressed me so much about Dave from the very beginning was that he would meet with any stakeholder group, and probably still does. Anybody who had a complaint, a concern, an activist agenda would be welcome at his table because, as he explained to me, it's always an opportunity for learning about what the impacts of the company are and where there might be risks and opportunities. So, but it's led by a human kindness and curiosity that is important to embrace and acknowledge as a leadership strength.
Yeah. Well, I did the same thing at, when I was at ArcelorMittal, partially because it was a union, shop. We went, I had more stakeholder meetings and union club meetings and all the things that were there. You had to listen and you had to get good.
It makes you a better company. There's no doubt. You have to seek them out. And as you know from your time at Acryla, there's not a lot of people in your company that want that job, right? So if you're willing to do it and willing to do it with empathy, it's a huge advantage.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you for mentioning Jeffrey's book. So Jeffrey Hollander, Built for a Better World. I'll read. It's been on my list. I also just read. In preparing, I'm always reading. Eric Ries, who wrote The Lean Startup, just wrote a book called Incorruptible, where he really came at the real structure of business. He looked at Patagonia's new structure, at, some of the fantastic book. But one of the things he came at was the fall of Google from don't be evil to where they are now and kind of the abandonment of don't be evil. And it was an interesting kind of piece of when you take these very simple, this is the tenet of who we are and our purpose, and you let it go, what happens? And it's do the right thing, right? It's do the right thing. Don't be evil. So I just finished that this weekend, but I will go to Jeffrey Hollander's book next. Thank you. Besides your own, tell us, what are your must reads? What do you tell people in this space they should pick up? So I'm curious now, 10 years later, what books do you hand people? What are books in this space that you feel like everybody should have on their shelf?
I actually have a couple of them. The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, which is actually
good, right?
a novel. But that book for me was transformational in a way that very few other pieces of art have been, because it paints such a vivid picture of how the world can recover from a crisis and become better and more sustainable. And we've been able to have him as a speaker at our conference, and his depth of knowledge about science and policy and everything related to sustainable economies is just incredible. So highly, highly, highly recommend that. I also recommend Hannah Ritchie, Not the End of the World. Similarly, this is the editor, lead researcher of our World in Data. So it helps us understand that we don't have to be in a doom spiral. And actually, some of the doom spiral is manufactured. And Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, I think is also a must read if you want to understand what our economy is really doing to the majority of people. And then last but not least, Black Genius by Dick Russell, which is, this is important to me because in business school, we're always telling stories and presenting cases. And they are 99% stories and cases about white men. The upcoming generations, the diverse workforce that we're having, the diverse leaders that we're going to have, need to see themselves in these roles. And even if you have a great mentor like Dave Stangis, it's very hard, for a person who doesn't look like Dave Stangis necessarily to see themselves in that role. I think it's important for us as leaders to go looking for those stories of success in our history that are not as frequently told. And that's a book.
You always have the best books, Katherine. And you guys, Boston College always has the best speakers. The other book that I think I've bought, Parag Khanna's Connectography, which
Yes,
is a
that's a
huge
great book.
tome, right? It is a massive book. I have bought and handed that book to more people. And he was a speaker years ago at Boston College.
I would always recommend anything by Dan Pink, who I think is
Yes.
just brilliant. And he has a 2-minute Pink cast that you can get that just, delivers
I love Dan.
short
Yeah, he's
insights.
amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fantastic. You always have the best books. I love it.
He's come to speak at the conference too a couple of times. Katherine knows this, but I approach content in a completely different way. A lot of books, and I read them in different places. I don't necessarily read these days traditional leadership books, but I read them all, like you name, In Search of Excellence. Toppler's, what was it, The Third Wave? There were so many things I read that formed my thinking way, way, way back when. I do think in the sustainability space, I actually probably met John Elkington before I read one of his books. And I still remember the date and I was, 97, a long time ago. It was when the GRI was launched in London.
Mhm.
We hit it off and we spent some time together in different things. He brought me on one of his tours and, down under. We did a conference series, but almost any of his books, and if it's one of the newer ones, great, even better. But I think that, and he always had the ability to kind of challenge me in uncomfortable ways, similar to a guy named Paul Herman, who, wrote The Hip Investor. He would always say like, yeah, great, but have you thought of this? And I'm like, no, I haven't thought of that. And, but I also read a lot of philosophy, not like old school, not Aristotle, Socrates, just, it's just the way I read. But on sustainability in business, I scan everything I can. So I absorb it in a different way. I literally go through the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Bloomberg every single day, every story, plus all the other newsletters we get. It's just the way I kind of absorb information these days. But I knew Katherine would always have some great, she actually, gifted me Capital.
It's such a great book.
That's a heavy read, though. You got to warn people before.
Yeah, it is a heavy read.
Don't buy the audiobook. It's like 85 hours long. You can't do it like that. I made that mistake. I always love, there was a great writing podcast. I'll link it in the show notes that Fareed Zakaria was on. And he talked about how he's really learned to scan business books in less than an hour, right? Read the introduction, read the end, scan through the rest.
The Heath brothers write some great books on change and, communication. And I just forget some of the ones I've read, but some of the themes that I like that I've been reading about today are, the literally cutting edge technology, cutting edge life science, what that means. It helps me think about like really the future a little bit. And, my wife thinks I'm crazy reading these books. Like, they sound like physics handbooks to her. But for me, it's all about like what's happening at the edges of things I'm interested in.
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
we haven't even scratched the surface of quantum computing. It's AI. We think AI is transformative. It's like,
no.
We just did a little post on LinkedIn. We're having some back and forth about it on where we see the first use cases for quantum in sustainability.
That's cool. I will look that up. So as we wrap up here, give me your advice as authors. I'd love to hear, what do you think is missing in the market? What advice would you give to a budding author in the space?
My advice would be read everything you can in your space. And if you feel like you still have a book in you that is specific to your voice, write it. Dave and I could never have done this without Dave. Let me just say that.
And vice versa.
I mean, we made a schedule and each of us took first authorship of the chapters that we were assigned, and then we handed them over to each other. So there was an accountability there. And I think even if you don't have a co-author, figuring out a way to make yourself accountable to finish the chapters and just not let the great be the enemy of the good enough for at least your first draft, that would be my advice. And work with a good editor if you can.
And mine would come down to like your audience, Marcy, like really picturing visually who you want to read this book and what like do you want them to walk away? Then you close that gap. And again, it's the way our brains work. Our brains work in different ways. What do you want them to be able to walk away with at the end? And then you put those pieces together with Katherine's advice. I think you'll have a great book.
Well, this is awesome. I hope you get a little spike on Bookshop and Amazon on 21st Century Corporate Citizenship from our little podcast here. It's so good to talk to you guys. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us on.
No, it's great, Marcy. It's good to see you both.
Yeah, good to see you both too.